Welcome to the next section of our course. This week you will learn about your role and responsibilities as a professional when dealing with victims of elder abuse. It will be followed by practical advice on how to help the victims. Today we will cover principles of intervention and empowerment. We will answer the question how to motivate older persons for change. And we will introduce a safety plan that is considered to be one of the most effective ways to deal with an abusive situation. We will start with some ethical principles. When working with older people, it is important to make sure that their rights are not violated and that decisions are taken to ensure their well-being. Sometimes, however, professionals face difficult choices. For example, when an intervention may result in an older person losing their only family member. Therefore, all situations should be carefully assessed to maximize benefits for an older person. Older people's privacy and dignity should be respected at all times. The least restrictive interventions that ensure older persons' autonomy are preferable. Older people should be involved in making decisions about their lives as much as possible. If needed, they should receive help with making conscious and informed choices, especially when the subject in question is very complex. For example, banking arrangements. Older persons' mental capacity can be temporarily affected by stress, anxiety, medication, illness or injury, and therefore lack of capacity does not necessarily indicate dementia. However, if an older person seems to be unable to make a decision, a formal assessment might be required to assess their capacity. Older people's freedom of choice must be respected, and mentally competent individuals have the right to refuse help. For example, if an older person is competent and chooses to stay with an abuser, this should be accepted. In such cases, professionals should assess the older person's safety and give them the necessary safety information. Professionals must know the legal requirements related to reporting violence. If there is a high risk to older person's physical safety or life, they must consult the police or social workers and take the appropriate actions, even if it goes against the older person's wishes. In case a crime is suspected or has been committed, professionals must act according to the laws of the country. Older people's right to confidentiality must be respected but should not be a barrier to taking action. Confidentiality plays an important role in the development of trust in a caring relationship. The older person should be reassured that any conversation will not be discussed with their spouse and partner or with any other member of the family without their consent. Cultural differences, religious beliefs, gender, older people's abilities and resources should be taken into account when communicating with them. If the older person agrees to get help, to proceed with intervention, certain professional principles should be observed. Intervention is defined as an action that is done by a third party, such as healthcare professionals or police, to end violence. The first principle concerns the victim's safety. It must always be a priority, and intervention should not worsen the victim's situation. For example, leaving any printed information about women's shelters at the victim's home where an abuser might find it, or calling a victim when an abuser is at home, is not acceptable and should be avoided. If the situation is life-threatening, action must be taken immediately to protect the victim. Another important principle is the client's right to self-determination. Mentally competent older people have the right to make choices that others may consider unwise or unsafe. Making such a decision does not mean that an older person lacks mental capacity. Next principle concerns cultural appropriateness. Cultural sensitivity is crucial to building trust between a victim and professional. It facilitates communication and helps the process of intervention. However, cultural or religious beliefs can never justify illegal behavior. Interventions must take into account and meet the client's needs. Even if abuse is unintentional or an abuser is a client. Therefore, focus on a client is another important principle of intervention. A holistic approach to intervention means that different aspects of the client's situation are analyzed and addressed. Providing help to an abuser or resolving the conflict between the needs of an abuser and the victim could also improve the client's situation. Another important principle of intervention is access to legal aid and law enforcement system. Professionals must explain all options to a victim, including involving the police, and be ready to refer them to the law enforcement agencies. Victims' confidentiality must always be respected. Confidentiality must be balanced against the possible consequences of inaction and risks the client is faced with. Professionals must document all matters of concern and report them to the relevant department or person in charge of the organization. It should be remembered that confidentiality exists between the agency or organization and the client, not between the worker and the client. Therefore, it is justifiable to share relevant information with other workers involved in the case or taking care of the client. Confidentiality cannot be used as a justification for failing to respond to abuse. If you feel that the older person needs to make changes in their life, you can carefully try to encourage them to do that. Keep in mind that it can happen only if you manage to establish mutual trust in your relationships and older person allows you to enter their life. To motivate a person for a change, ask how they used to cope with violence before. Afterwards, you can together look for new approaches to manage the situation, offer them different options of support. Always keep in mind that you are responsible for the older person's safety and the goal is to help an abuser as well. Be realistic about the situation, but do not scare the older person too much. Give them time to find motivation for this change. Keep in touch with the person and make sure to address the issue of violence, to check whether the situation escalated or not. When working with older abused women, professionals should remember the following rules. First of all, believe victims. Even if they say something that seems untrue, assume that they might have experienced trauma at some point. If you suspect a memory disorder, depression or delirium, Contact a healthcare provider. Talk less and listen more. Allow victims to talk at their own pace. Focus on the safety of victims. Ensure victims' access to relevant information, education and other forms of social and economic support to help them make their own informed decisions which reflect their needs and interests. Respect older women's decisions. Support their independence and autonomy. However, keep in mind that decisions older women make can involve risks. Remember that empowerment is a process by which women set their own goals and get access to resources which can help them achieve these goals. Make sure that older women have access to the judicial system and their rights are protected. As discussed previously, leaving an abuser might not be an option for some older women due to several reasons. For example, a sense of responsibility if woman is a carer. Therefore, if an older woman decides to stay with someone who physically abuses her, a safety plan must be created to help her restore control over her life. A good safety plan is victim-centered and is based on the older person's goals and needs rather than the opinions of others. It is a form of solving problems before they arise, and professionals should support the empowerment of an older person by building a good relationship with an older person, learning about the older person's fears related to the perpetrator, asking an older person about their wishes, reasons behind their decisions and their goals, which might allow a professional to offer any options for reaching the same goals. Brainstorming solutions and ideas together. When creating a safety plan for an older person, ask the following questions. Has an older person had experience with safety planning and protection strategies before? If yes, then which strategies have worked or been effective? How has the perpetrator behaved in the past? Is the perpetrator likely to reoffend? Does the perpetrator have access to weapons? Have weapons been used in the past? Is there a restraining order in effect? If so, how long will it remain in effect? Ask an older person to share this information with friends, neighbors, and service providers. Can an older person recognize the signs of violence or a violent act? What is the living situation of an older person? Discuss possible ways of leaving their home or hiding if the situation escalates into violence. Start with discussing the safest way to leave or the safest room to hide in. It should have door locks and window to call for help. Then agree on a safe place for an older person to go and or temporary living arrangements. If an older person has a disability, are there any physical barriers to safely leaving their home and or getting to a safe place? Does an older person have a peephole in the door as well as door locks and chains if the perpetrator does not live with them? Where does an older person keep important phone numbers and personal documents? Items like medication, prescriptions, bank cards, ID card, health insurance card, money, clothes. Have pet care arrangements been made? Has an older person practiced giving precise information on where they will go if there is danger? This can be practiced together. Is an older person willing to move to a safe place, like shelter? Has an older person been advised to write down or document all violent incidents? For example, a date and what happened, text messages, emails, and phone calls should be saved. What are the older person's community and social support networks? Does an older person have information about different support services? What challenges may affect the older person's safety and their ability to implement a safety plan, like alcohol or substance abuse, mental health issues, memory disorders? Is an older person comfortable with a safety plan and willing to accept its possible restrictions, at least in the short term? As a result, answers to these questions will provide the older person with a safety plan which is unique and perfectly relates to their situation. Thank you for watching the video.